First, we're announcing charges against 5 new defendants in the investigation of fraud in the Housing Stabilization Services Medicaid program here in Minnesota. The first indictment, United States versus Hassan Ahmed Hussein and Ahmed Abdirashim Muhammad, involves the owners of Pristine Health LLC, a housing stabilization services company here in Minnesota. These 2 defendants enrolled in the Housing Stabilization Services program, purportedly to provide services helping people who were facing housing instability find and maintain stable housing. They did no such thing. Instead, they submitted fraudulent claims to Medicaid for services that they did not actually provide to those individual clients. In all, they obtained more than $750,000 in Medicaid payments through their fraud scheme, much of which they used for pretty extensive international travel, including to London, Sydney, Australia, Istanbul, Turkey, Dubai, and several locations in Saudi Arabia. The second case being announced today is United States versus Kamil Omar Salah, the owner of Safe Lodgings, Inc., another housing stabilization services company. As with the other defendants, Mr. Salah enrolled in the housing stabilization program and began claiming to be providing housing stabilization services to people that were leaving drug and alcohol rehabilitation facilities. Again, he did no such thing. Instead, he just submitted fraudulent claims for services that he never provided. He submitted more than $1.4 million in fraudulent Medicaid claims, which he used to purchase more than $150,000 in cryptocurrency, as well as to fund his lifestyle. We learned recently that Mr. Salah actually fled the United States, after his company received a grand jury subpoena for records related to its participation in the Housing Stabilization Services program. The fourth and fifth defendants are charged in United States versus Anthony Waddell Jefferson and Lester Brown. And this case is slightly different. This is an instance of what's essentially fraud tourism. Mr. Jefferson and Brown were residents of Philadelphia who had no connection to Minnesota, except for they heard that Minnesota and its Housing Stabilization Services program was easy money. And so they traveled to Minnesota, enrolled their companies, Chosen Runner LLC and Retzel Real Estate LLC, in the Housing Stabilization Services Medicaid program here in Minnesota. They then returned to Philadelphia and began submitting fraudulent claims to Minnesota Medicaid here, through which they obtained more than $3.5 million in fraudulent Medicaid payments. This fraud tourism is new, although we've heard of it as investigators here. I mean, these defendants came here not to enjoy our lakes, our beautiful summers, or our warm people. They came here because they knew and understood that Minnesota was a place where taxpayer money could be taken with little risk and few consequences. Fortunately, through the hard work of the agents, that we have been able to charge them for their role here. Now, to date, we have charged 13 people for their role in the scheme to defraud the Housing Stabilization Services program, and that investigation remains very much ongoing. We expect additional charges in the coming weeks and months. I also want to announce some updates in the fraud scheme, or the scheme to defraud the Early Intensive Development and Behavior Intervention for Autism program, another Medicaid program here in the state of Minnesota. Today we unsealed charges against the second defendant charged in the case, Abdi Najib Hassan Youssef, who owns Star Autism Center in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Mr. Youssef, like others involved in the autism scheme, paid kickbacks to parents to have their children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and enrolled to receive EIDBI services at his autism center. Based on these fraudulent claims for services that were not provided, and in many cases were not needed, he received more than $6 million in Medicaid funds. He used some of those proceeds to purchase a semi-truck for $100,000, and he also sent more than $200,000 to Kenya. Earlier this morning at 10:30, the first defendant charged in the autism fraud scheme, Asha Farah Hassan, pled guilty. As you may recall, Ms. Farah was the owner of Smart Therapy LLC, a Minneapolis-based autism clinic. Through her clinic, she participated in both a scheme to defraud the EIDBI program, as well as a scheme to fraudulently obtain federal child nutrition program funds under the sponsorship of Feeding Our Future. Through these fraud schemes, Ms. Hassan received more than $14 million in Medicaid payments and more than $450,000 in federal child nutrition program funds, of which she sent at least hundreds of thousands of dollars to Kenya, which were used to purchase real estate. Now this morning, that's the EIDBI program. This morning we also executed a search warrant related to investigation into another Medicaid program here in Minnesota, a state Medicaid program called Integrated Community Supports, or ICS. ICS was a program that started in 2021 here in the state of Minnesota. It was designed to help people with disabilities live more independently in the community with assistance, with one-on-one help with health issues, safety, and other household tasks to allow them to live in the community as opposed to in an institution. Through this program, providers obtain apartments in which their ICS clients can live. In theory, the providers are supposed to be giving daily assistance to those clients to help them live independently in the community. That assistance can include community participation, helping them get out and about in the community, helping them with household management, setting up medical appointments, and issues with household safety and day-to-day safety. In reality, what the investigation has shown is that many ICS providers did no such thing. Instead, they simply obtained apartments or condos, which they rented to people who they got qualified to receive ICS services, people with disabilities that would qualify them to receive ICS services, and then just put them in there and started billing. The ICS program would allow providers to bill hundreds of dollars a day for each ICS client that they had, often more than $100,000 or even $200,000 a year for each ICS client. But in reality, that's not what was happening. Now, this program, like the others, this ICS program saw a similar pattern of explosive growth in recent years. Since beginning in 2021, the first year that Minnesota offered Medicaid coverage for integrated community supports, it has grown from $4.6 million in 2021 to more than $170 million in 2024. And as you can see, the 2025 numbers were through September 30th, but they're on pace for nearly $180 million, despite the efforts to get a handle on the fraud in recent months here in Minnesota. In all, since 2021, Medicaid has paid out more than $400 million to Minnesota providers of ICS support services. Now, this pattern you see on the board is very similar to ones you might be familiar with in these other investigations. You see that explosive, even exponential growth. The Housing Stabilization Services, which also started in 2021, has a similar pattern of growth. It just kept growing and growing and growing each year. And again, this program was estimated to cost $2.5 million a year. But the data from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services show that it costs significantly more than that. And in fact, housing stabilization has cost more than $300 million since 2021. The EIDBI autism program has a similar pattern. It's cost the state more than $1 billion since starting in 2018, or it's cost Medicaid more than $1 billion, and has grown, as you can see, every year significantly larger. And of course, the original scheme that started all this was Feeding Our Future and the Federal Child Nutrition Program, and as you can see here, a similar pattern of explosive growth. I want to talk a little generally about the investigation and the scope. I know there's been a lot of questions recently about the scope of the fraud and the amount lost. The state in recent months has flagged 14 Medicaid programs as having significant fraud problems. For those 14 programs, which include the Housing Stabilization Services Program and the EIDBI Autism Program, the state's issued a payment suspension for 90 days. They've ordered a third-party audit of all providers in those programs, and they've even canceled the Housing Stabilization Services Program altogether. Now, these services, there are many more. PCA services, adult day services, non-emergency medical transportation. Now, we've been talking for some months about the fraud problem in Minnesota, and I've always believed that if you speak the truth in a plain-spoken way, people can handle it. Minnesotans and taxpayers deserve to know the truth of the fraud. The fraud is not small. It isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. It's a staggering industrial-scale fraud. It's swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state. I spoke in the fall about the iceberg I saw ahead. Something's fraud that's much larger than what's been visible to the public. When I said that, it wasn't hyperbole or rhetoric, it was a warning. And today I want to talk and I want to show here a sense of what that iceberg looks like, because I think people deserve to know what that is and how big this problem is, because we can't solve the problem until we grapple with the size of it. So the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services pulled the claims data for these 14 programs dating back to 2018. And those 14 programs in Minnesota have cost $18 billion since 2018, and more than $3.5 billion in 2024 alone. So that's a sense of the magnitude of the problem. These are the 14 Medicaid programs, which is just a part of Medicaid, these waivered services that have been flagged as having issues with program integrity and fraud. Now, I'm sure everyone is wondering how much of this $18 billion was fraud. It's not the $1 million question, that's the $18 billion question. The answer is far too much, and the task ahead of all of us is not only figuring out how much of that money was fraud, because we know a significant amount was, but figuring out how to put an end to the fraud in our state and get control of it. So let me end with this before I take questions. The magnitude of the fraud in Minnesota cannot be overstated. It's staggering amounts of money that have been lost. But it's not just about the money that's been stolen and wasted. This is a problem that's caused all of us to question what kind of state we live in. I think it's eroded our sense of collective statewide self-esteem and confidence. It's caused we have a state, as I've said before, that has long taken pride in having a strong economy, good schools, beautiful lakes, mini parks, and a sense of community spirit and civic mindedness. This fraud really calls into question all of that. And I know that it's gone on, it's been allowed to go on far too long. And we need to do whatever we can to stop it in its tracks. Thank you.
Joe, could you give us a bare minimum of how much of that $18 billion you suspect will turn out to be fraud?
I think a significant portion.
Joe, could you talk about how much you have charged in court connected to fraud you've uncovered? What's the dollar amount of that?
Well, we prosecute people, not dollars. Feeding Our Future, Amy Bach, the head of Feeding Our Future, was convicted of carrying out a $240 to $250 million fraud scheme. Several other defendants that were charged in what we call collectively as the Feeding Our Future case were actually not under the sponsorship of Feeding Our Future. So the very first quote-unquote Feeding Our Future trial was actually a group of individuals that owned Empire Cuisine and Market and other related companies. They carried out a $49 million fraud almost all of which was under the sponsorship of another entity. Similarly, a case called United States versus Haji Salad, which charged 7 or 8 defendants with carrying out a $25 million fraud scheme under the sponsorship of Partners in Nutrition. So you do the math, $250 million plus $50 million plus $25 million. That's well into the $300 millions just in the federal child nutrition program fraud scheme. These other programs here, housing stabilization, autism now between 6 and 14, that's $20 million that's charged in the autism program so far. Housing stabilization, I haven't done the math, but it's well over 10 that's charged now. And obviously that's just this team's efforts. There's other prosecutions going on that have been flagged for many people. Evergreen Recovery is a case you may recall that I think was $30 million involving rehabilitation or drug and alcohol treatment. So it's a significant amount.
Joe, Asha Hassan, how many people like Asha Hassan fit into 2 buckets?
Well, Asha Hassan's the one that's been charged with and now convicted of both buckets, but many defendants in these cases were getting money from multiple government benefit programs, many Medicaid programs. This is how these investigations grew out of Feeding Our Future. I think roughly 24 or so Feeding Our Future defendants were getting money from autism clinics, and that's why we got caught. That's how we learned about the autism fraud. And if you look at the bank records, many of which were admitted into evidence at trial, you'll see many other healthcare companies from which charged defendants and convicted defendants were receiving funds.
And when we talk about the benefit, like I was in court for her sentencing or plea today, and the government talked about somewhere between $9 and $25 million she'd be, was on her shoulders, her smart therapy,
Yep.
restitution coming in at $15.9 million. These numbers are all over the place. Can you explain why it's 9 to 25 and we're settling?
Well, 9 to 25 is the sentencing guideline range. There's an enhancement based on the loss amount, and one of the sort of windows of loss amount is between $9 million and $25 million. So that's just a product of how the sentencing guidelines are. The 14 or whatever million she owes, that's a combination of the money she fraudulently received from the EIDBI program and the federal child nutrition program. Again, normally often media will ask about the loss amount or how much have you prosecuted. When we prosecute people, not dollars. Our forensic accountants can answer some of this, but we're focused mostly on not only charging defendants. The reason we charge defendants is to stop them from committing fraud. So housing stabilization, maybe we've charged $10 or $15 million worth of fraud in terms of those individual defendants. But of course, the state shut down the program that was costing more than $100 million a year. So does the prosecutor get credit for that? That's for other people to decide.
Joe, can you confirm
So
that
it's taken
the
4
fortune?
years to get to where you are today. How long is it going to take to get to $1 billion worth of charges? Or $2 billion worth of charges? A year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
As long as it takes.
Just, I wanted to confirm, the 14 programs that have been designated as being at high risk, these are now programs that the federal law enforcement agencies are actively investigating, correct?
Yes, we're looking into all those programs, yes.
And as you look across the country, are there any other examples where the cost of Medicaid-funded programs saw this kind of exponential growth? Is Minnesota clearly an outlier when you look at spending on these programs across the board?
I think we're an outlier in a bad way, yes. Have I gone through every 50 state? No, but you don't see fraud on this scale in other states. And part of that is just we sit here as a team, and it's a relatively small team. We're a relatively small U.S. Attorney's Office, and every day we look under a rock and find a new $50 million fraud scheme. That shouldn't be the case in a state of our size. Certainly other states have problem with frauds, but I think our problem is unique insofar as we've just opened the door. What we aren't seeing here, traditional Medicare or Medicaid fraud is people overbilling, upcoding. So you're instead of billing for a service with a relatively modest reimbursement, you claim to be providing a higher dollar value service, and you get more Medicaid payments or reimbursements that you should be entitled to. That's traditional. You may be getting 20% more. You're padding your bills. What we see here, and what I think is unique to Minnesota, is that's not what we're looking at. What we're seeing is programs that are just entirely fraudulent. These aren't companies that are providing some services but overbilling Medicare or Medicaid. These are companies that are providing essentially no services. They're essentially shell companies created to defraud the program, created to submit on a wholesale level fraudulent claims for services that aren't necessary and aren't provided. I think that's unique to Minnesota.
Joe, which programs are the worst after you've looked at these? Which ones, which ones have the most fraud in it? Which are the biggest?
Well, Feeding Our Future obviously was entirely fraudulent. Essentially, it's hard to say. EIDBI is an incredibly lucrative program. Some of these other ones are quite large. I think the PCA program is over $1 billion or $1.5 billion a year alone. So I think there's a significant amount of fraud in that program. Which is worse? I think that's a normative statement, a value statement that I'll leave to others.
This is 18 billion over how long? 18 over how long?
Since 2018.
Since 2018.
Yes.
Could you talk about the funds that were sent out of the country? There's been a lot of concern about that in other cases in regards to the money sent to Kenya.
Yes, there's a significant amount of money sent abroad, mostly to East Africa, much of it to Kenya and to Nairobi. The money that we've traced, most of it has been used to purchase real estate in Nairobi, where there's a large Somali diaspora. So we've traced much of it. In fact, the first trial, United States versus Abdiaziz Farah, we had days and days of evidence showing the money that was sent to Nairobi and the real estate purchases that they made there, including the construction of an entire 10 or 12-story apartment building.
But you haven't uncovered anything that shows that these funds were funding terrorism.
Correct. Well, there's no indication that the defendants that we've charged were radicalized or seeking to fund al-Shabaab or other terrorist groups. Some money went to Somalia. Indirectly, some money might have gotten to the hands of al-Shabaab, which controls significant parts of Somalia and imposes a tax there. So that's a little more nuanced than there's no indication that defendants were sending money to terrorist organizations or were supporting terrorist organizations in that way.
Joe,
You're
you're
obviously
looking to
looking-
figure out how
you-
much of this $18 billion is fraudulent, and what kind of work is it going to take to determine that?
It's going to take more than just prosecutors, that's for sure. I mean, we're prosecuting what we can. This is far beyond the capability of a group of prosecutors and law enforcement agents, although we're working around the clock and hopefully we're getting some reinforcements. But, a lot of this is going to have to come down to regulators and other people looking into the problem and stopping the flow of money, which has overwhelmed our system and overwhelmed our ability to prosecute.
You're obviously looking a lot at what happened in the past, but looking forward, how confident are you in the measures that are being taken right now by Minnesota lawmakers to prevent more fraud from happening?
Well, I'll let them decide whether their efforts. I'll say this: I'm heartened by the fact that people are paying attention and trying to stop it. Obviously, we prosecute backwards crimes that have happened. That's how it works. And I think we've been clear that we can't prosecute our way out of it. I'm glad that people are taking it seriously and trying to shut off the faucet of funds that are flowing out to these fraudulent entities. Yes, AJ.
Fraud tourism cases.
Yes.
Is there any indication that this company even had an office here in Minnesota?
I don't know the answer to that. They did rent an office, although I'm not sure how active it was. My understanding is they lived in Philadelphia and they came here to enroll patients, and then whatever forms they submitted from their homes in Philadelphia.
No indication that there were employees working here while they were employed. Is that...
No.
To the question about the lawmakers and partnerships there, can you talk a little bit about the partnership of the office with the U.S. House Fraud Prevention and Oversight Committee, and whether you believe that committee should also be handing over whistleblower complaints to state resources like the Attorney General's office and the DHS OIG?
I can't comment on that.
Can you say,
court
Joe, can you
today-
say how many, entities roughly in these $18 billion worth of programs you guys do have active investigations on, and sort of like what the suspected fraud is among those entities that you're currently investigating?
I can't comment on which entities we're investigating specifically.
I'm not asking for specifics on names, I'm just talking about numbers. Can you say you were investigating dozens or over 100? Can you put any kind of numbers on it?
No.
In court today, we said that Asha Hassan owes $15 million in restitution. Realistically, how much money are you going to get back?
Well, it depends. It's defendant by defendant. We seize assets from many people. If they have money in bank accounts, we're very aggressive in seizing those funds. If they purchase real estate, especially if they purchase it without financing, we're very aggressive in getting that property back, and we can liquidate it and use to pay off. In the Feeding Our Future case, for example, I think we're somewhere between $60 and $70 million that we've recovered. About $30 million of that is cash or liquid money seized from bank accounts. The rest is a combination of real estate and cars. How much money we'll get out of that will depend at the end of the day. But there's many multi-million-dollar properties that were purchased outright with no financing, no mortgage, and so we're going to get a considerable amount back in that. Otherwise, it's case by case. Yes.
When you say $18 billion, the programs cost $18 billion, are you saying cost the state or the federal?
Medicaid. Those are Medicaid funds.
Really
Yes.
quick, I know the Autism Center investigation
14 programs, these people who are committing fraud are billing multiple programs across Minnesota to get as much as they can out of the state.
Many are most individuals that we've investigated and charged. If you look on Open Corporate, say the website, you'll see that they have multiple healthcare entities, almost each of which seems to be created to bill a specific Medicaid program, usually one of the 14. That's a significant red flag. Normal medical professional wouldn't operate that way.
And Joe, just to piggyback that, is that a clear sign of fraud, or are there legitimate people out there in Minnesota that have an autism center and an ICS business?
I mean, they certainly, you could do it legitimately. That's just not what we've seen, and I don't think our problem is that we're casting unfair aspersions on legitimate medical providers here. That's not been what I've seen when we've investigated.
Can you talk about
Yes.
the statute?
This is the first time we're hearing about ICS and those search warrants today. Could you talk about the scope of the investigation now? How many providers are you looking at?
We're going to look at the program holistically, and so I don't want to give away our details in like how we target individual providers, but we'll be as comprehensive as we possibly can be.
Can you talk about the statute of limitation in these Medicaid cases? Given the volume of money, you're looking at the number of players. Are you working against the clock in terms of having the opportunity to charge a finite number of people before you run into a statute of limitation issue?
Well, the standard statute of limitations is 5 years, so that's a long time. But in 5 years that'll become an issue.
When do you expect charges in the ICS investigation?
We'll see. I don't know.
There have been other investigations reporting of similar alleged Medicaid fraud in other states like Maine. Is there any connection there? And are you working with other states to see if there are any kind of connections?
We have our hands full here in Minnesota, so I've seen those reports and I wish them well in the District of Maine.
You kind of casually mentioned that perhaps you would get backup for these investigations a few moments ago. Is that to say that the Department of Justice is going to send more prosecutors to help this office out? You said it was a pretty small office and you've got a big problem on your hands.
Fingers crossed. We'll see. It's easier said than done. I don't know. SG's warm today, but in January we'll see if people want to come from Florida and DC to help out. But I'm hopeful. I will say this: the department has been incredibly supportive at the highest levels of the Department of Justice, and they've said they'll get whatever we need to work this aggressively. Obviously, I know we have the best team in the business. I think our results speak for itself, and we're going to continue working around the clock. Scott.
Joe, can you say anything about whether the ethnic cast of characters in the uncharged cases you're investigating resembles the cast in the charged cases that you have taken to trial and convicted and gotten pleas in?
Generally, yes, it does.
Are among the $18 billion, I know you said it's a significant amount that is fraud. Is it a majority? Is it up to half? How much of it is legitimate?
I don't make these generalizations in a hasty way. So when I say a significant amount, I'm talking in the order of half or more. But we'll see. When I look at the claims data and the providers, I see more red flags than I see legitimate providers, and overwhelmingly so.
So you're saying you have reason to believe more than half of that $18 billion likely represents fraud?
I'm saying that's very possible, yes.
Is there a point where any legal responsibility falls on anyone in state government for allowing this to happen? And I mean, is the reason that there's this extent of fraud because of the way Minnesota handles benefits?
Well, I think it's fair to say, and everyone's been saying, I've said it before, that our state has done not a good job of minding these programs in terms of responsibility. There's lots of levels of responsibility. There's criminal culpability, obviously, and then there's other accountability. And obviously, I think all of us as a state have to grapple with that. And that's not just prosecutors and law enforcement agents, but regulators and politicians and news media, community leaders. And I think that process, that conversation is starting to happen, and I hope it continues to.
A lot of these fraud cases in other states have involved people in state roles who are actually implicit in the crime.
Any tips from, say, the House, not the U.S., as Quinn said, but the State House Fraud Committee, or anybody at the state level who is now generating some casework for you guys?
The question, I should be repeating the questions here. The question was, are we getting tips from the State House Committee and other people? We get tips from all sorts of sources, and we follow them up as we get them.
So you're rattling off some of the clawback dollar amount. Do you have a more firm number total that the government's been able to claw back through these cases?
Well, it's hard because a lot of it's real estate, and I'm not an expert at valuing real estate, especially commercial real estate. It's not as simple as Zillow when you're talking about, for example, the 300 block of East Lake Street that we have a Liz Pendens on and we're seizing as part of the Feeding Our Future investigation. I think they bought it for $2.8 or $2.5 million. You know, I can't tell you how much that's worth sitting here today. You need there's experts that do that, appraisers, and that'll happen in the normal course. We can't seize real estate assets and sell them, liquidate them until a judgment of conviction is final. So that's after sentencing. So that process is ongoing.
Joe, we're
In
talking
other
a lot
states,
about
public
money.
officials have been.
What is the real human harm that you're starting to see?
Well, these are real programs, and the housing stabilization is a great example. You know, the Medicaid fraud cases need real beneficiaries. You got to have a Medicaid number, a Social Security number, and they have to qualify. Sometimes people are being qualified for services that they don't need. But in many cases, and the housing stabilization program is a great example of this, many of those individuals needed help finding stable housing. They were leaving drug or alcohol treatment centers. They needed a place to live. They needed help. They were enrolled in these services that they not only needed, but they wanted, they thought they were going to get, and they didn't get it. And they weren't, instead of having someone help them find stable housing, they didn't get that at all. And there's a real human cost to that. You know, more generally, these are 14 programs, and I'm not a healthcare professional, but I'm sure if a healthcare professional is standing here, they might tell you about some of the important work that some of these programs are doing. And there's real need. I assume these programs were created because there was real need in the community for some of these things. You know, recuperative care, autism services, autism spectrum disorder is a big issue in the United States, and I know many people that have children with ASD need services. It's a real challenging situation. Fraud on this scale puts all of those programs at risk, and there's real patients, real clients, real people who need services and aren't getting them. And I think these fraud investigations, the level of fraud we have, put at risk all of those programs and lead to the question of, can we even afford to have this stuff at all?
Joe, have you had any conversations with DHS officials or these other departments that run these programs as to why you can see red flags in more than half of the providers, but apparently they couldn't, to the point that they never shut it down?
I can't comment on what they did. I mean, obviously the state hasn't done a great job, but hopefully they're changing in how we do this. You know, I think people had good intentions, at least at start with some of these programs, but not, I think the regulatory mindset maybe wasn't there in the way it should have been.
In other states, they've actually indicted state officials for being part of these schemes. Are you investigating any state officials involved with any of these programs for suspected?
I can't comment on defendants that were or individuals we're investigating that haven't been charged yet.
Where do we go from here? Any sense of how many more people we could see arrested? Dozens? Any kind of a number you could give us?
We are working as hard as we can to address the fraud program in the only way that we're able to, which is charging defendants and seizing their assets. And so I would expect to see additional charges in the coming weeks and months, as much as we can here with our team.
Does fraud oversight need to change at the legislative level, or is that something that can be done within the existing state statute?
You know, I'm not an expert on the statutes in Minnesota, so you'd have to ask an expert. I think the answer probably is both. But okay, thank you all.